we move on to a session on governance and licensing. And speaking with us, we're very fortunate to have Chris Bavitz, who's the Wilmer Hale Clinical Professor of Law at Harvard Law School and co-director of the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society, and a managing director of the Cyber Law Clinic, and has lots of experience in providing legal advice to open source software projects, and has been a great resource for us as we think about the governance and licensing of OpenDP. And he'll tell us what some of our current thinking is along those lines. I think he had some contributions from our program director, Annie Wu, in preparing this.
That's great. Thanks so much, Salil. Can folks see the slides and hear me okay? Good. All right, great. So you go from James, who is a political scientist by training, to your token lawyer. I'm sorry, but I will try not to bore you with the legal minutiae. This is actually, I think, a really interesting topic, and one that's been certainly fun for me to help the OpenDP team think about, and that is, as you build a large institution and a large community that is by nature distributed, how do you think about two very interrelated questions? One is how to govern that community and to govern the project and keep the ship sailing straight while maintaining all these sort of contributions from the community. And then the related question, of course, is sort of what do you do with the intellectual property that's generated here? So I'm going to talk briefly through a handful of different topics about governance models, the open source software licensing for code. Interesting questions about the use or not of contributor license agreements, which is something that I know the team is thinking about now. And then lastly, briefly, just about there are likely to be some non-code outputs from this project, and thinking about open licensing there as well. This audience and this community has such a depth of experience in participating in very large open source development projects, and so I'm hopeful that I will lay out a few thoughts today, and then we can spend some time tomorrow. I think it's at 1:15, and Annie and I will run a session where we would love to field tons of questions and get your comments and input on all of this and more. So we'll look forward to that. So let's talk really high level about governance models. And just first, before we get specific about OpenDP, the notion of governance generally means a lot of things to a lot of people. The need for governance exists anytime a group of people come together to accomplish an end. That's about the broadest definition you could possibly have. There's a whole field of internet governance that thinks about design and administration of the web. There's a whole field in law of corporate governance that thinks about how companies run themselves. And so what we're talking about here, as I said at the beginning, is this question about how this particular institution, OpenDP, can run itself, can achieve its goals in a way that is organized and structured with both technology rules governing the inputs and outputs to the project, and people rules, the rules that govern the behavior of the people. In a way that's productive, organized, and but maintains the sort of distributed ethos that we talked about. So let's get specific about OpenDP. A lot of our thinking about this emerged from some work that colleagues and I put out at Berkman a few years ago, and this report is online, and we can circulate it if you'd like. That's just answers exactly these kinds of questions. How do you structure an open source software development initiative? Salil mentioned I run a clinical program at HLS where students and I advise projects, and it's a very regular occurrence for us to have a project come to us and say, we're starting to think about organization and intellectual property. And I say, well, do you have a corporate form? Like, what are you? And they say, well, we have a Slack channel. And so, okay, you need something a little bit more than that. And so this gives some ideas of how this can work. And the first question that always comes up when you're trying to address these kinds of situations is, well, what do you want to do? What are your goals? And in the white paper, we got a really nice, crisp recitation. This is sort of an abbreviated version of some of the stated goals of OpenDP: enable and encourage contributions from a diverse community, encourage adoption of OpenDP software for the specified use cases, facilitate collaboration, partnership among a really broad range of stakeholders. That's one of the things that makes this question particularly interesting in this case, that the stakeholders include individuals, businesses, academic institutions, and government organizations. Create this and foster this community, well-defined process for contribution, vetting, and testing, ensuring OpenDP has the resources needed to meet its strategic directions and figure out how to raise funds and keep the institution moving while maintaining this very community-focused mission. The ideal would be to have a governance structure that can transform and evolve through the organization's life cycle stages. So to state the obvious, there are two kinds of at a high level structures that you could use to accomplish those goals. And some of those goals, if we go back over them, I think would lend themselves to, on the right there, sort of a more traditional top-down structure. Think of a corporation that has a C-suite and a very clear delineation of administrative functions, and things like some of the vetting processes and the sort of the quality control functions we've been hearing about today, and that even came through in that list on the last slide, I think would lend themselves to something that is very centralized and strong. But in almost every one of those goals, we hear the word community, and we think about a fully distributed structure at the complete other end of the spectrum, where you can imagine an organization like Wikipedia, for example, that really relies almost exclusively, entirely on this broad network of people to come to the table with contributions. As is always the case in these situations, almost always the case, I think the right answer for OpenDP is probably somewhere in the middle. And so what they've tried to do is to come up with some organizational ideas that I think will balance the desire to remain distributed, that focus on the community with the need for a little bit of structure to both define goals and then accomplish them. So first and foremost, and again, a lot of this is in the white paper, is the community, and this project will rely extensively on contributors, maintainers, committers, and there's been an idea from the first time I talked to Salil about the project that there's going to be significant, regular, early, and ongoing engagement with the community of people who are going to be writing code and contributing to this project. The fact that we're having this meeting today is the first of those, but again, I think the white paper talks about a plan for annual or semi-annual meetings, and the idea is to have community involvement, not just at the level of individuals writing and contributing code, but involving the community and helping to think through and craft a sustainable approach for growth for the project. So that's the sort of the community focus, and I wanted to make sure that that comes first, because that's sort of the way I think the project has been thinking about it. At the same time, again, all from the white paper, we have the beginnings of an organizational structure forming in the form of some of these committees and advisors that are we've heard about over the course of the day. And the executive committee is currently constituted: Mercedes, James, Gary, Michael, Salil, and Annie. We have some, I think, DP application leaders who will be coming online, the ad hoc design committee, whose work has been referenced a few times today, and then some additional organizational elements that I think will become more important as we move forward. And I want to just highlight one of them, because I think it's interesting, is sort of this editorial board idea. It's interesting to think about, again, the Wikipedia example, where for OpenDP to succeed, there needs to be a quality control of vetting element. This project only works if you go to the repository and access a piece of code, and that code is good and strong and does what it's intended to do. And so I think this is an area where, again, striking that balance between deference to the community and engagement of the community in writing and contributing modules, but all subject to some sort of an editorial, almost a peer review process, to make sure that we're putting product out there in the world, putting code out there in the world that achieves the security and privacy needs that we say that it's going to achieve. Let's move on from governance to talk about the second topic. And again, lots of things we can talk about on all this. So if we have a couple of minutes at the end, we can discuss, and we'll certainly talk about all this in a lot more detail tomorrow. The second question has to do with open source licensing. So if we're going to have a repository of code, what license should govern that code, and what license should we require that contributors make the code available under to the world? So the first question I always ask when I'm thinking about this question is, well, do you need one or do you want many? There is no particular reason why you have to choose one. You could build the GitHub of OpenDP and have every individual piece of code on there subject to its own license. That's a very common model. And I think in the conversations to date, it's been decided, for reasons that make, I think, a ton of sense, that actually this corpus that's going to exist in OpenDP is really designed to be interoperable in a way that we don't want to have anyone saying, I'm grabbing this, and they're not going to be able to work together. So there's a premium, I think, has been placed on the idea that rather than letting people come and contributing code under a wide variety of licenses, they're going to select one, and we're going to go with that. And the current thinking now is to select the MIT license, which is nice because it is short enough to fit on, not just on one slide, but basically onto a napkin if you wanted it to. It is as simple and elegant, as straightforward as can be. really, you can kind of do what you want with the code, subject to an as-is sort of warranty, a couple of those classic lawyer things that are all caps around warranties, disclaiming certain kinds of warranties, but otherwise, the permissions granted free of charge to anyone to use or deal in the software without restriction, including the right to use, copy, modify, merge, etc. In thinking about this, obviously, in addition to the interoperability question, we wanted to think of what is the goal of the open license here, and are there kinds of uses that we want to restrict or limit? And are there, and I think in the end, the idea was that this is a kind of a project where, as we talked about earlier, there are commercial stakeholders, there are community stakeholders, there are academic stakeholders, nonprofits, you name it. We want maximum uptake, and we want maximum access and use of the materials that come out of the database. And it just seemed like an obvious case for use of the MIT license. Again, for those of you who've done a lot of work in the open source development world, there are lots of options out there, but this one seems to be one that is straightforward, simple, will encourage people to come to the table and get involved and contribute, and will encourage users, licensees on the other end, to take the software and integrate it into their own systems. So that's the thinking there. Interesting question on the again, many of you probably have a lot of experience with it. There is a way to run an open source development project where everybody simply retains the copyrights, the intellectual property rights in the code they want, and essentially contribute it to the database subject to the chosen license, in this case, the MIT license. There is an alternative, which is to say that everyone who contributes code gives the underlying copyright in the piece of code to a central organization or institution. And then that organization or institution takes the intellectual property rights subject to the promise to put it out under a broad license, again, in this case, MIT. There are a couple of advantages of using a contributor license agreement, which is centralizing the ownership of intellectual property in a single entity. It helps the party managing the open source development project to ensure that the contributors have the necessary rights, so that you can draft that contributor license agreement to make clear you represent and warrant contributor that you have the rights to do what you do and contribute what you contribute. It also can include some language that can be helpful, that avoids any disputes later on down the line about whether a particular contributor was contributing code in his or her own capacity or as an employee of a particular organization. We've used contributor license agreements in projects in the past that actually have a sign-off section for an employer to say, yes, I know so-and-so is my employee. Typically, I would own their IP rights, but I understand they're participating in this project, and I'm fine with that. So I think these are benefits of a CLA. There are costs. Some people coming to the table and volunteering their time to contribute to a project like this might have concerns about executing an agreement like this. And I think, again, putting a pin in this, saying this would be a great topic for discussion at the breakout tomorrow. It's something that I want to make sure we give a lot of thought to. The last thing, really briefly, is to talk about anything other than code. So again, code, MIT license, possibly with a contributor license agreement. And I'll just say briefly, to the extent that there are other forms of contributions, and one example is the OpenDP white paper that you all have received, and that is sort of the basis for all of the presentations we're seeing today. We expect that there will probably be at least some of those kinds of materials out there that are text-based documents, images, perhaps audiovisual materials. I'm spitballing here, but other things that would come out. And I think the obvious answer for that is a Creative Commons license, just as we have a wide variety of open source software licenses available from Apache and GPL and MIT. We have the suite of Creative Commons licenses, and the decision's been made to go with the CC BY 4.0, which is essentially, in some ways, very similar to the MIT license. The only requirement in the CC BY licenses, BY licenses, is that you attribute the source, so that we get an accurate attribution of the source being OpenDP and or the particular contributor to the project. Other than that, there's not really much you have to do. So I think a real brief summary of the terms of the CC BY 4.0 license. As with open source software licenses, there are many other options out there that we could choose that would be more restrictive, that would confine people from using these kinds of materials in commercial products, that would restrict them from making derivative works based on them. I don't see, again, much like thinking about how licensees use the code, I don't think that there is any real interest in worrying about those kinds of concerns. And the goal, as with the software itself, is maximum uptake, maximum use, simplicity, and CC BY licenses seem to fit with that goal. So with that, again, I think the roadmap for tomorrow, to go back to the slide, is to kind of have each of these four bullets up there. And I would particularly love to hear, again, from those of you who've done this a lot. We can talk about the MIT license. I would particularly love to hear about the contributor license agreement question, because I think that's a really important one that we want to give some thought to. And any concerns or questions, and Annie has been very deeply involved in the setting up of this governance structure in the committee. We can talk generally about governance, but also about the particular committee structure that OpenDP's put in place. Tomorrow would be a great time to do that. We have 4 minutes left. Annie, I don't know, is there anything else you want to add on the governance side before we jump in? Otherwise, if folks have questions, we can answer one or two now, and then please bring lots of questions for tomorrow.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. I think you covered everything very well. I don't have any questions just yet, but I also want to emphasize what we're trying to build is a community, and then having the community input is very, very important to us.
Great.
Thank you, Chris and Annie. There is one question here in the Q&A on governance from Christina Elvento. In some cases, code may need an accompanying proof or paper. Can you say more about how the MIT license might impact publication of papers/proofs in journals or other venues? And maybe to just add on that, something that maybe wasn't explicit in Michael and Marco's presentation. What we do imagine is that together with a code contribution will come attached the proof, which may or may not be written in the same way that the proof would be in the paper that one publishes, but it would be something similar to that.
This is a great question, and one that I'd love to spend a little time on tomorrow if folks want to talk about it. So I think that the MIT license probably would not necessarily cover a proof that goes along with a piece of code that is contributed to the project. That piece of code would be covered by the chosen open source software license, Apache GPL, or in this case MIT, and/or a contributor license agreement to cover the code. I would think that a proof as written up in a paper could be a couple of different things. One is it could become its own Creative Commons licensed contribution, which we would make available and publish under a CC license. The other thing I guess we'll need to think about on that is about the publication practices and copyright practices of journals. So for example, I assume that people are going to contribute code to the database and then want to publish in a reputable CS journal, statistics journal, that paper. And we'll have to think a little bit about how those two things interact. I think obviously, I don't want to speak for the OpenDP team, but the project would not want to do anything that would interfere with your ability to place that paper in a journal by any means. At Harvard, we have an open access policy. So for those of us who are here, there are some affordances by being associated with Harvard where we pre-commit some of our academic scholarship to DASH, to the Harvard's open access repository. And it may be that other people at other institutions can do the same. So it's a long way of saying I think we're either going to have to come up with a mechanism where rights in that paper are given to OpenDP to allow them to share it, or rights are going to be vested in a journal or in the author themselves, and OpenDP can kind of link out to it.